I assume you're here because, like me, you think Iron Man is pretty cool, and you probably bought the secret lair. And now you're on the hunt for 60 cool budget cards to pair it with. Well, you've come to the right place. I've built my version of this deck with the intention of getting as close as possible to being Iron Man. And to me, that means a deck where my commander is close to being a one man army, has significant firepower, and, most importantly, has cool Stark Industries tech that can be called upon to solve tricky situations that we just can't blast our way out of. Before I run through the deck in detail, here's what I decided I want my deck to be before I started brewing. I definitely wanted to use all the cards in the secret lair. I also wanted to have a reasonably linear game plan in an ideal game. It's really easy to get lost with a broad commander like this, having too many lines and too many targets, resulting in slow, boring turns, and quite often brain melting games. I wanted the deck to be fun to play, and hopefully as fun to play against. I definitely did not want it to be a combo deck. This is both because I've already got that experience covered in my Stellar Lee deck, and because to me, Iron Man ultimately wins his battles with his blasters. Tech is an aid, but not the ultimate firepower itself. And lastly, I wanted to live the Iron Man fantasy, but without needing the Tony Stark bank balance. The deck is $100 all up, including the secret lair cost. If you've watched my videos about deck building, you'll know that I like to start really broad, and I scrolled through every available non-creature artifact in Scryfall. Originally, I wanted to build two lists, one Voltron full firepower deck, and one toolbox version solely focused on Stark technology, with no combat damage win conditions. I quickly realized that while there are tons of artifacts, 80% of them either don't work well with our commander or are just bad. If we then remove the non budget options, it means a purely toolbox version just probably wouldn't work. In early playtesting, it also dawned on me that equipment interacts a little awkwardly with Iron Man. You attack and sacrifice an artifact to tutor up an equipment, but you're already in combat, so you can't equip it until your post combat main phase. This meant equipment heavy lists would be clunky, and that I didn't want to build a purely Voltron version based on this. It's worth calling out that there are some equipment that would equip at instant speed, but their abilities pale in comparison to the good stuff. The last realization I had was that most of the good artifacts worth tutoring were stacks. The deck I wanted to build is one that was fun to play against and that I could play in casual pods, so I needed to make sure the deck wasn't just all oppressive stacks. I ended up with a deck that is a mixture of both combat and tech. I have some cool, powerful combat augments, and I have a bunch of cool tech to deal with specific problems. The deck is reasonably strong, but it can comfortably hang with everything from slightly upgraded precons all the way through to higher casual power level decks. In terms of how the deck works, the early game is mostly focused on ramp, and the game really starts once we have Iron Man out. Given you're here, I imagine you already know what he does, but in short, whenever he attacks, we sacrifice a non creature artifact, tutor up for a slightly bigger one. The entire game plan revolves around attacking with Iron Man and tutoring up powerful tech to keep both him and ourselves alive, and then to dish out increasing amounts of commander damage and repeat the process turn after turn. But enough about that. You're here for card choices, so let's talk about those. I'll talk about my card choices in a couple of rough categories: land, ramp, draw, protection, removal, recursion, sacrifice fodder, and last but definitely not least, the Stark Industries tech. Mana base is super simple. It's a bunch of basics and a few dual lands, which in truth we don't really even need. If you want to find room in the budget for additional cards, just swap out some of those dual lands. A special call out for Buried Ruin that can allow us to recur something. Our ramp is also simple. We do need ramp, which in this case is a bunch of mana rocks, but beyond needing to get Iron Man out early and reliably get to 5 mana, there's no real tech here. Given we're running singular solutions to many problems, and we aren't running a lot of redundancy across similar cards, we need some ways to get back critical artifacts that end up in the graveyard. Trash to Treasure is definitely my favorite, as we typically have a bunch of small token artifacts lying around to sacrifice. This also synergizes really well with our card draw. We can easily make the most out of cards like Demand Answers, Thirst for Knowledge, or my favorites, Big Score, Pirate's Pillage, and Unexpected Windfall. Partially because of the budget, I've opted for less protection strapped to equipment, and I've gone with more protection spells. Given our deck revolves around Iron Man, we've got a whole heap of ways to protect him. split between cards that make him hexproof, counter spells, and deflecting spells. There's not a lot of protection from board wipes here, which is one of our only weaknesses, noting that we do have a recursion package. When it comes to removal, we've got a bunch of ways to manage opposing creature threats in our Stark technology, so we don't have tons of removal. That said, we do have a few highly synergistic removal options. Earthquake, Delete, and Desynchronization are all board wipes that don't hit our commander, allowing us to defend ourselves and, most importantly, put ourselves in a winning position simultaneously. Chainsaw is tutorable, can bolt a creature, and can act as a win condition if it sits on the board racking up rev counters. Given a card like Chainsaw can be so good, we probably don't want to have to sacrifice it to Iron Man to tutor up our bigger artifacts. So it's important that we have some cheap disposable artifacts we can sacrifice for that purpose. Okay, let's talk about the tech, where the majority of the interesting decisions were made, and where the fun comes in. First, we'll talk about combat augments, and then we'll talk about our problem-solving tech. Basilisk Collar is a cheap way to get us lifelink. Commander's Plate is self-explanatory, given it's in the secret lair. Tarion Soul Cleaver is one of the most important cards in the deck. Firstly, it gives our commander vigilance, which is critical, and it's one of our strongest win conditions, as the amount of counters we get, both from our artifacts and our opponent's creatures going to the graveyard, is incredibly high. Dowsing Device is a secondary finish option. It procs immediately 95% of the time, and it will usually add 5+ power to our commander in the mid game, easily going up to more than 10 in the late game. Blackblade Reforged offers us some redundancy in case our opponents deal with our primary win conditions. Junkjet offers us a very similar functionality and pairs well with some of these power increasing artifacts. Champion's Helm is our primary source of hexproof. When I was building the deck, I didn't want to create one where Iron Man is untouchable the moment he's in play, by running multiple protection pieces like Greaves, Boots, etc. The Helm exists mainly if I'm playing into a removal heavy pod where I need some protection. And lastly, Hexplate Wallbreaker is a fantastic finisher if we're trying to close out the game. That rounds out our offensive options, but Iron Man wouldn't be complete without the tech, starting with the Stone of Eric. If you need an answer to opposing graveyard shenanigans, look no further than the stone. If you're up against a spicy combo deck, or perhaps a Storm or Cascading Criminal, Vexing Bauble will probably stop them right in their tracks. If an opponent is ruining your day with a Maze of Ith, or perhaps committing Field of the Dead crimes, Arc of Blight is here to save the day. And Cursed Totem is a really handy way of dealing with tricky activated abilities. Whilst this isn't going to be needed every game, it does mean you're not going to get shut down by cards like Royal Assassin or Spore Frog Recursion. Our deck runs very few creatures, so we need some defense. One such line of defense is a classic, Pit Trap, to deter enemies from sending their biggest boys at us. Speaking of defense, Crawl Space is a card you'll want to use almost every game. This limits our opponent's go-wide strategies and pairs well with some of our other cards to make it very hard for our opponents to send meaningful damage our way. Esoteric Duplicator fills a very important role. We don't have disposable artifacts at 3 mana cost or above, so the Duplicator allows us to sacrifice something important like a Champion's Helm or Crawl Space to keep building out to more expensive tech, whilst also keeping all the important game pieces in play. Sculpting Steel backs that up, copying an important piece of tech or win condition for redundancy. We're mainly running this as part of the Iron Man theme, given it's the bonus card, but if it weren't for that, this is a slot I'd potentially open up to a replacement, upgrade, as we can't target some of our important legendary artifacts like Iron Man, Blackblade Reforged, or Tarion Soul Cleaver with the Sculpting Steel. Horn of Deafening is the first of 2 cards to pair really well with Crawl Space and Iron Man, creating a really tricky defense to deal with. The second, whilst not quite as good, is Icy Manipulator. Probably one of the hardest general stacks pieces in the deck is Portcullis, a great way to ensure that once Iron Man is down, your opponents don't power out bigger and scarier threat. Next up is a card that I absolutely love in my Eldrazi deck. It's the Goat Simulator, Trading Post. A fantastic jack-of-all-trades value engine where you can gain some much-needed life, make some chump blockers, or recur your artifacts, or even draw cards at the cost of your mini tokens. A bit like Esoteric Duplicator, Mirrorworks gives us some great redundancy in the deck and can do some fairly silly things. Just note, again, that we can't copy our legendary artifacts. Speaking of legendary artifacts, you've probably seen Ugin's Nexus before, but it's essentially a card that sets up a win for us, giving us an extra turn. Sacrificing the Nexus will allow you to fetch God Pharaoh's statue, which will make it quite difficult for them to interrupt you on your extra turn. Last but definitely not least on our list of tech is Wondrous Crucible. One of the best ways to use it is to discard it to one of our draw spells, and then reanimating it with Trash to Treasure or Argivian Restoration. You'll be surprised how often people forget about the Ward 2 on all your permanents and how that seals the game. Not to mention the free stuff it gives you. Speaking of free stuff, it's totally free to blast the heck out of the like and subscribe buttons. And the only thing more free than that is the comment section where you can tell me how much you love or hate what I'm cooking up. Now that we know what's in the deck, how do we play it? And what do we tutor for? And when? Let's start with our opening hand. The most important thing is the correct mix of land and ramp to get Iron Man out reliably. The next most important thing is cheap protection to ensure we get our combat triggers. Nothing else really matters as we can tutor it up. My ideal hand would be 3 lands, a mana rock, a Pirate's Pillage style spell, a form of protection, and a piece of sacrifice fodder like Servo Schematic. This means our early game is very linear. We're ideally hitting our land drops and ramping. If we don't have mana acceleration, we can of course play other things, but it's not ideal. As soon as we can, ideally reliably by turn 4, we want to get Iron Man out so we can start gaining value. If we have a piece of protection in hand, I strongly recommend waiting a turn to play him with that protection online. The reward of playing him a turn earlier isn't worth the risk of him getting removed and setting us back 2 turns. If, however, you don't have any protection, just swing for the fences. Once you've started swinging, you then need to decide what to fetch. If there's a particular problem you need to solve, always prioritize opening your toolbox and fetching that tech rather than the win conditions or combat power. The most likely targets here will be stopping creatures from smashing you in the face. Things like Crawl Space, followed by Horn of Deafening and Icy Manipulator, or your go-tos. If, however, you're free to fetch up some blasters, my order of priority is usually Tarion Soul Cleaver, then Commander's Plate, a Champ's Helm if I'm in a pod where Commander's Plate doesn't adequately protect my commander or it's just a control-heavy pod, and then Dowsing Device, and lastly Hexblade Warbreaker. The triple threat of Tarion Soul Cleaver, Commander's Plate, and Dowsing Device should be more than enough of a threat to close out any game, given we only need to deal 21 damage. A major general tip I would give you is to think about what you're going to want to tutor for ahead of time of your turn, especially in the first few games with the deck. Not doing this will leave you fumbling through your deck and likely making rush decisions because you feel bad about causing everyone to wait 5 minutes every time you attack. The result of all this is a deck that's fairly straightforward to pilot, both because it's linear and because you can tutor up every turn to ensure it's predictable. The deck does, however, offer up enough variance to make the games interesting and fun because of the toolbox dynamic. The last thing you probably want to know is how you can upgrade the deck. If you like the theme and play patterns that I've built here, then whether it's a good or a bad thing, I think there's actually not that much that you can add to the deck that will dramatically change how it plays. If you take an obvious upgrade in the case of a One Ring, sure it gives you powerful effects, but not really effects that synergize much with the existing deck at all. All this said, here are some ways how you can upgrade the deck. Starting with protection. An offer you can't refuse, Swan Song, Arcane Denial, and Fierce Guardianship are all good additions. I'd swap out Dispel, Stoic Rebuttal, Mizium Skin, and Swerve for them. On the artifact end, there are a number of cards you can swap in, starting with the One Ring. One cool thing about the ring is that you can get rid of it with Iron Man to stop taking damage, despite it being indestructible. I'd probably swap out Portcullis for it, or maybe one of the card draw spells, like Thirst for Knowledge. Silent Arbiter is another fantastic addition to protect you from creatures. I'd probably cut Portcullis. Whilst not really tutorable with Iron Man, Excalibur is a great card, and it fits the deck perfectly. Given it's a strong win con, I'd sub out Junk Jet. Hammer of Nazan is up next, and is arguably one of the best additions, as it allows us to fix a problem with the deck by equipping things instantly as we've tutored them up. To fit it in, I would take out Blackblade Reforged. Embercleave is a well-known and strong card, and is another possible addition. It probably fulfills a similar role to Hexblade, so you could swap that out if you wanted to add in Embercleave. Shadow Spear is a straight up improvement if we swap out Basilisk Collar, and both Stronic Resonator and the Roaming Throne can get us additional commander triggers. I would probably swap out something like Panic Spellbomb and perhaps Mirrorworks. And last, but definitely not least, is a card that's more fun than pure power, but Mjolnir could be really fun to answer very wide boards, especially if your opponents have flying blockers. And that's it. My take on Iron Man. If you have questions, hit me in the comments and let me know your thoughts on the deck and possible additions if I've missed anything. Thanks for watching.